I solve Stephen Bartlett's conversation problem. Stephen Bartlett has built a podcast empire extracting frameworks from the world's most successful people. 2-hour conversations, deep dives, thoughtful questions, guests sharing their wisdom strategies and insights. And he's already created an audience that gets perspective shifted every episode, but never implements anything. By the end of this video, you'll understand why long-form conversation content creates insight addiction without action, why repackaging other people's frameworks prevents depth, and why the format itself guarantees his audience stay stuck in permanent learning mode. This isn't about Steven specifically, he's just the most visible example of someone who scaled manufactured insight consumption as a business model, and the results are predictable. Here's what happens when someone discovers Diary of a CEO. Monday, episode with a neuroscientist about dopamine. Makes perfect sense. They feel enlightened. Wednesday, episode with an entrepreneur about focus. That resonates too. They take notes. Friday, episode with a psychologist about relationships. Mind opening. They screenshot quotes. Next Monday, episode with a different expert contradicting Monday's neuroscientist. Also makes sense. Each episode gives them the feeling of learning something profound without requiring them to do anything with what they learn. They're getting perspective whiplashed. Every guest has a different framework, a different model, a different explanation for the same problems. And Stephen's job isn't to synthesize these into coherent advice. His job is to just make each guest sound convincing for 2 hours. So the audience gets exposed to 100 different frameworks across 100 different days. And they just can't implement any of them because they're too busy consuming the next framework. The podcast becomes insight entertainment, not transformation, not behavior change, just the feeling of learning without the work of applying. Here's what Stephen's format creates. 2-hour conversations feel deep. Guests go into detail. They share stories. They explain their thinking. But depth and breadth are different things. Stephen's conversations with the guests covers their entire framework in 2 hours. Their business philosophy, their relationship advice, their health optimization, their mental models. The guests spend 20 years developing these frameworks. Stephen's audience gets the compressed version in one setting. That's not depth, that's summary. Real depth would be take one framework from one guest, study it for a month, apply it, see what doesn't work, refine it, integrate it with your life. But Stephen's audience doesn't do that because there's another episode tomorrow with a different guest and a different framework. The format prevents depth by design. It's structured for maximum idea exposure, not maximum idea integration. And the audience mistakes exposure for understanding. They think, I listened to a 2-hour conversation about this means they understand it. They don't. They just heard someone else explain it. Here's the structural issue. Stephen interviews people with fundamentally incompatible worldviews and presents all of them as equally valid. Episode 1. Hustle culture entrepreneur says, work 16-hour days, sacrifice everything, that's how you win. Episode 10. Wellness expert says, burnout is the enemy, rest is productive, balance is everything. Both can't be right, but Stephen's format doesn't resolve the contradiction. He just nods along with both guests. His job is to make each guest's framework sound compelling during the episode, not to help the audience figure out which framework actually work or how to do between contradictory advice. So the audience ends up with a cognitive whiplash. They're trying to simultaneously believe you need to work harder and rest more. You need discipline and self-compassion. You need to plan everything and be more spontaneous. You need to optimize everything and accept yourself as you are. These aren't complementary, they're contradictory. But the podcast format doesn't filter for coherence, it optimizes for engagement. Every guess sounds right in the moment, and the audience is left trying to reconcile 50 different frameworks that don't quite fit together. Here's what Steven's audience experiences. They listen to an episode about morning routine. The guest has an elaborate system: cold plunge, meditation, journaling, exercise, specific breakfast, no phone for the first hour. The listener thinks, that makes sense. I should do that. Next day, they hit snooze, they check their phone, they skip breakfast. They feel guilty for not implementing what they learned. Next episode. Different guests with different morning routine advice. The problem isn't that the advice is bad. The problem is that hearing someone else's system doesn't give you their discipline, their context, their years of building their habit. You get the compressed output without the iterative process that made it work for them. And Steven's format doesn't include the implementation part. There's no follow-up episode. We checked back with 100 listeners who tried to implement last week's advice. Here's what actually worked. It just, here's the insight. Good luck applying it. See you next episode for a completely different insight. The gap between heard the framework and can execute the framework never gets addressed. And the audience stays in permanent learning mode because they keep hoping the next episode will have the framework that finally clicks. Here's what's actually happening. Steven built a business model that scales on insight production, not insight integration. More episodes equal more guests, more frameworks, more content, more listeners, more revenue. His incentive is produce more conversations with interesting people. The audience need is help me figure out which framework to actually use and how to make them work in my own life. These aren't aligned. Steven makes money when people listen to lots of episodes. He doesn't make money based on whether people successfully implement what they heard. So the format optimizes for maximum idea exposure, guests with different frameworks, minimum resolution, never synthesize contradictions, constant novelty, new guest, new framework, new perspective. And the audience optimizes for feeling like they're learning, mission accomplished, never having to do the hard work of integration. Avoid it. Everyone gets what they optimize for, but nobody gets the transformation. The podcast isn't designed to transform you. It's designed to give you the feeling that transformation is possible if you just consume enough episodes. That feeling is enough to keep you listening. You don't need to actually transform to stay engaged. So what do you do about this? You can't solve implementation gaps with more insight consumption. You can't fix framework contradiction with more frameworks. You can't escape learning mode by learning more. Steven's podcast works as entertainment. It's genuinely interesting. The guests are accomplished. The conversations are well produced. But it's not a transformation tool. It's an insight theater. If you actually want to improve your life, you need to pick one framework for one episode, ignore everything else for 90 days, actually implement it, see what breaks, refine it for your own context. But that requires you to stop consuming, and Steven's business model requires you to keep consuming. You can keep listening to every episode and wondering why your life hasn't changed despite all the wisdom you've heard. Or you can acknowledge that hearing other people's frameworks and having your own frameworks are completely different things. Most people won't stop listening because the podcast gives them the feeling of progress without requiring actual progress. But at least now you know why you have 47 episodes in your changed my perspective mental list and 0 changes in your actual behavior. It's not that the advice doesn't work. It's that you never stop consuming long enough to apply any of it. The next episode is already uploaded, and it promises a perspective shift that will finally be the one that sticks. It won't be, because the format itself prevents implementation by design.